Walt, I'm back in America. I even had a visitor on my flight, Sir Richard Branson, of all people. He flew into Miami. He was in the front and I was in the rear with the gear, but that's how things go. And while I come back, it's boy, oh boy, it's acceleration of autonomy. Maybe somebody got nervous that I was in England learning about what they're doing. But all joking aside, Tesla released FSD 14. You somehow got it. Then NHTSA opens a preliminary agreement into Tesla for FSD. And then, oh, lo and behold, Waymo goes and hires 4 lobbyists from Minnesota. A lot to break down this week. But the big question, you got FSD 14. Does it go up your driveway?
Yes, I was very pleased to be added to the early access group for Tesla. And I did get FSD 14. My testing has been pretty limited so far just because it's been a very busy week. So first, on the very positive, I basically pressed a button. The thing backs out of my driveway, drives all the way to the fish store, which I've talked about on this podcast a lot, pulled into the parking lot, which is a very tight and small parking lot, and then parked. So, check mark, something obviously we expected. Obviously, people are talking about it. But yeah, that was a big positive. On the flip side, it still can't figure out my driveway. It wants to I think it's possibly because my driveway is not on the map. It's not in the center of where the front lot is. At one point, it went to my neighbor's driveway and pulled in there. I'm trying to train it to do so. So it looks like the car can quite easily go, end their ride in a driveway. But for whatever reason, I still can't get it to go up my driveway. So hopefully I will provide an update if and when that happens. The funny thing is, I think on FSD 12, there was one time on my wife's Tesla that it actually did go up the driveway, but I continue to have that as a problem.
When I get it, hopefully this weekend, I'll see if it goes to my driveway. But you went your neighbor's driveway. Did you wave and say, "Hi, honey, I'm home"?
These are long driveways, so I didn't get up to that point. And I stopped it and tried to encourage the car to make that turn into my driveway. Why don't we go through some of what other people experienced this week who also got 14.1? And you're familiar with some of these people, I think.
I am. We got Holmar's blog, and I'm going to quote this here. It says, 14.1 is way smoother, less jerky, more confident turns. Dirty Tesla, it's an interesting name, but he's been quoted by Elon several times. And quote says, best version yet on highways, but still gets weird in city lanes. And then I'll use the term mixed commentary on Reddit. What are you experiencing? Is it smooth? Is it jerky? What are you experiencing?
The whole Mars thing is just weird. I mean, it's definitely not what I would consider smoother. It's not worse. And by the way, I said this last week. I'm not sure for me how it can get better. It already feels like human driving. I prefer when FSD drives to when I drive. But if anything, there are moments when it feels like it's trying to be more safe than prior versions, and as a result, there are some hesitant or jerky kind of moves that I've experienced thus far. The interfaces are very different. You don't scroll up and down in terms of mileage. You choose a lot more, versions of how the car is going to drive. So I've been messing around with that a little bit, and that might have had something to do with it. And there was also one situation where I was pulling out of a parking lot, and there was a metal, I don't know what was impacting the car, but there was a metal drain there. But for whatever reason, it was about to go up to make an unprotected left, and then it backed up almost for the camera to look at what it was in front of and what it was driving over. Again, I'm just speculating what the car was doing, but physically it just backed up, and then it went on its way. And it almost felt to a point where someone was controlling the car to get a better look. Hey, I'm going to back up from here, take a look, and then say it's okay to drive. So I'm wondering, is it possible that there are, the early access group is not a large group, I think, of users. Is it possible that they're sending certain scenarios back to a remote evaluator to decide, yes, you can move forward and continue to drive? Because I've also seen on social media situations where people have said, it didn't do something, then it started to do something, it was almost thinking on the spot and changing its mind. I almost wonder if in these rides, is it possible they're sending it back to a human to determine whether the remote driving should proceed?
Anything's possible. I mean, at this point, it's pure speculation until we get a note from Tesla. But I'll ask you this. Since you had very limited experience with FSD 14, do you feel that it's another step forward towards FSD unsupervised. Have you seen any major improvements?
Yeah, obviously the major improvements are it parks at the destination, right? You press a button and then it just goes. So like the concept of pressing a button on your phone and hopping in a car and it taking you to a location, which it parks. And I think Elon was talking today about how like you could get off at the front of a store in a grocery parking lot, and then the car goes and looks for a parking spot on its own. So obviously that's a major development forward. It's just interesting that in the actual writing of it, there's been some changes that I don't know. Maybe again, it's trying to be more safe than not. That just changed a little bit about the feel, not necessarily to my preference, but I think when you look at it on balance, it's obviously better in terms of the functionality. Now, Grayson, the question though I have for you is, that's fine. This is this universe of FSD 14.1. What does this mean, if anything, to whatever version of FSD is happening in Austin right now? And what does it portend, if anything, about when that safety attendant is going to get pulled out of the passenger seat in that market?
We don't know what version of FSD they're running in Austin. I still believe it's a fork of some version of FSD optimized for it. I stick to my prediction by the end of the year, probably I would say around November, that the safety driver gets removed.
I agree with that. I just don't know if this 14, whatever we're seeing in 14 gives us any kind of signal, as people would say, in terms of getting closer to that. I think we have to consider them as two very separate things in terms of that development. So, and again, like the functionality of being able to park is just going to be much more useful. I think over time, with incremental updates, some of these other things that I've experienced might clean themselves up, but and we'll see about this kind of it almost like changing its mind midway, where you actually feel that mind changing, in the middle of your ride, how that kind of works out and what's really happening there in the background. Is it the software doing this? Is there a human involved? I don't know. I would doubt that it's a human involved, but like it just felt like that might have been the situation, but it was a one-off.
I can't wait until you go to dinner, you get dropped off in front, and the vehicle goes and parks itself and comes back and gets you. That's going to be great. Well, Tesla's advancing on the technology. They're taking bumps and bruises on the policy side. This week, NHTSA opened a preliminary, that's the key word, a preliminary investigation into Tesla looking at FSD, specifically with 58 reports of issues involving traffic safety violations when using FSD, including 14 crashes and 23 injuries affecting 2.88 million Tesla vehicles. What are your thoughts on this? Because last week we talked a little bit about the politics here, but what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think it's just an extension of that, right? And none of these crashes or injuries are new information. This is, some of the new stuff, at least that was highlighted by Senators Markey and Blumenthal, were about some of the, the railroad crossings and things like that. So it's just, the politics. And by the way, credit to NHTSA. Well, actually, there's no press release. So this is really more of a Reuters thing. So it's not like they're being responsive to pressures from Markey and Blumenthal. For all we know, this NHTSA investigation had already been, going on for some period of time. But that's their job, right, to keep people safe. And, at the end of the day, like that's what we're trying to do here, right? You have whatever 60,000 or so people that unfortunately are killed on our roads that have nothing to do with autonomy, but you want, as this new technology to evolve, for it to be safe. That's the whole point, right? To save lives. And then obviously we know we have our views on how that's going to change the economy. So I guess my question back to you, Grayson, is how do you think this will go? I mean, I have a good feel for how processes go with the FCC, the FTC, the DOJ. I've been through these things hundreds of times. Don't have as much, experience or none in NHTSA. What's the timeline? What are the possible procedures that stem out of this if they find that there's an issue that they need to progress on?
The timeline, I'm not going to comment on. I'm going to cop out on that for the simple fact there's a government shutdown and we don't know. So I'm going to defer to that on that. From a procedural process, this is hypothetical. I want to say this is hypothetical and pure speculation on my part, where in a hypothetical situation, if NHTSA does potentially find something, they will issue a recall. Now, I want to clarify the issue with the recall because what will happen is they will say, okay, there's an issue potentially with railroads. Tesla will push out a software update. That is not a recall. In my humble opinion, when it's a software update, the word recall has to go away, and you call it a software fix, a software update, a software enhancement, because you and I both know the headlines around the world. Tesla recalls 2.8 million vehicles. They're not recalling them. They're not going into a shop. It's a software update.
Right. It's a terminology differential. But the weird thing is, like, some of the, forget about the train thing for a moment. Some of the other things that I saw written about in the press about the issues that existed in terms of going through a red light or not going through or not moving during a green light, like many of these things I've just never experienced. And I've been through, I mean, I want to say thousands, but at least hundreds of stoplights with FSD. And at least for me, sample of one never has actually, gone through the light that I can recall. I think I might have recalled that if that was about to happen. So I don't know. How do you recall something that maybe has already been, even if it occurred in the first place, already been patched? On the other stuff, sure. Like, if there's issues with road barriers or things like that, and the company can come out and say, like, okay, here's your software update, whether they call it a recall or not, it'll be fixed, and then they can move on to the next thing. But I think your answer, though, relative to maybe some out there, some of our listeners that have, often given us feedback, is shutting the whole program down, icing them for 6 months. Do you think that is a possible or probable outcome, where it's not just, hey, send this recall software update? It's, no, freeze the program for 6 months or a year or whatever.
I'm going to give you the non-politician answer. No, not possible. Not going to happen. That's the definitive answer.
Okay. Well, I don't want politician or not. I just want the truth. Like, what's going to happen
on that front? So let's go back in history. This has happened many times throughout history. It's all documented on NHTSA.gov. You can go through it. You can all see the documents. Tesla has issued quote unquote recalls many times before. The same thing's going to happen. They're going to issue a software update, and then people are going to scream, it's not safe, NHTSA's corrupt, all the usual talking points. But NHTSA is a great organization that's doing really good work to make the roadways safe. And they have a great administrator, Mr. Morrison. They have great staff, and they're going to do the right thing at the end of the day.
So meanwhile, in the regulatory front around the world, in Sweden, Tesla just got approved for FSD testing there. So, I find it interesting because not exactly like a pro Elon market. When I deal with stuff on SpaceX and some of the regulatory approvals that they need to get there, one of the things we always have to consider is how politics, get involved in the approval process that Elon needs to face with many of his different companies to get to the next step. So I think probably a positive step if in Sweden you're getting FSD testing.
There have to be company-owned vehicles. 3 vehicles for 3 years is the permit, and that becomes the 7th country in the world to approve FSD. So it's a very big positive, because I believe over time you are going to see countries that do not want to be left behind on autonomy. And you had a speech from the president of the EU saying she wants autonomy to be built in the EU, and we're seeing what's happening there. And it's a conversation for another day, but I believe that countries are going to open up and start to really want this technology and openly embrace it.
So the other interesting part of this, Grayson, is while Sweden does have its own currency, they are an EU member. So this, I think, is the first country in the EU. And that's interesting because I'm like, is that how it's going to work in Europe, where individual countries will provide Tesla with FSD testing? Maybe that happens initially, and then ultimately the EU comes in over the top and either squashes what these individual countries are doing or promotes it further. I mean, Europe is obviously a challenging space, and as I've seen with SpaceX, it can be, politics obviously can play a role there.
I don't know where things are going to go with Tesla in the EU. I will say I have to study the EU market more from a regulatory standpoint. I have met with the European Union Commission that's regulating autonomous vehicles. The laws aren't done yet, but I need to do more homework before I can give you a conclusive answer.
I mean, we have our own issues here in the United States where, even just this week, we're learning that based on some press reports, Waymo is hiring several people to try and get into Minnesota, because at the state level, they can't launch driverless robotaxis there because the state there requires a person to be on board and who is able to take over driving if necessary. Presumably that means immediately. So there needs to be some state changes there. Again, no national framework.
And that's the issue. Waymo hired four lobbyists to go in there and try and change the law. They have to lay the groundwork. The timing from a hiring is very good because the Minnesota State Legislative Body goes back into session on Tuesday, February 17th. That session runs until May 16th. And then upon the completion, if that's when it ends on May 16th, which is scheduled to, but it could be extended, Waymo could legally be operating in Minnesota by August 1st, 2026. That's when the laws would take effect if they were able to get it through this session. So a lot to watch, but that's the timeline for the audience from a policy perspective of when they could legally operate commercial robotaxi services if they do get a bill and it is signed by the governor.
So do you think they hold back on doing anything in that market before, basically making this a test market or whatever the term, the road trip market, because they don't want to enrage any of the local policymakers there by putting undue pressure on them?
Well, if you look at Boston, that would give you an example why. You look at Seattle and give you another example why. Unsure. Waymo's policy team one time is doing this strategy, and the next time they're doing this strategy. So I don't know what strategy they're going to do. The fact that they've hired the lobbyists, they're starting the engagement process would signal to me that perhaps they'll announce it as a road trip, but Walt, pretty soon it's going to be it's going to be cold. There's a lot of snow in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So maybe they disguise it, say, hey, we test in Buffalo. We want to test here because of the weather. I'm unsure at this time.
The other interesting thing about Minnesota is that's the home state of Minneapolis. That could be attractive because it's one of the few markets left in these top 20 markets that Waymo still has not announced the plans in. And, this is something we track pretty closely at LightShed. And if you look at the top 20 markets from top to bottom, they haven't done Chicago. There's been some speculation, but nothing really there. Riverside, San Bernardino, you can maybe comment on that. 12th largest market, nothing planned or talked about there. Minneapolis and Tampa. So Riverside, San Bernardino, I kind of get. We'll talk about Minneapolis. Well, let's talk about Minneapolis and Chicago first. Like those have clearly harsher weather than, a New York or a Boston. Is that the reason why they've been left off? It's just this heavier snow? Because I went to the Super Bowl in Minneapolis. Thank goodness we actually won back then. And while there's a ton of snow in Minneapolis, they do a hell of a job at cleaning the roads. So what is the fear factor between Chicago and Minneapolis of entering those markets?
I don't know what the fear factor is. When you were at that Super Bowl, there was an autonomous shuttle that was operating there. Very small controlled environment, but they did operate it there. And there is a willingness from the local city government to deploy autonomous vehicles. So perhaps that's why we're seeing Waymo hire the lobbyist. Chicago, politics.
Yep.
There's no other way to summarize it but politics. And I'm pretty sure, and I'm pretty confident Waymo could handle the lake effect, but they can't handle the politics at this point, in my opinion.
I mean, can you imagine? So let's put Riverside aside for a moment. Tampa's the other one. So let's briefly talk about Tampa. I think you might have some familiarity with it. It's in the same state in which you live in. But how is Tampa not already done? How do you not do Tampa if you're Waymo and you're doing like Nashville, which is like the 35th largest market?
Full disclosure, I was involved in several conversations about roughly 5 years ago with the city of Tampa, Hillsborough County, which is the county, and the AV companies. Talks broke down between several companies. This wasn't one company. Talks broke down. There was a mayor who did not really care for this technology. Whether that's the reason it broke down, I'm not going to speculate. But early on, there were talks. It is a fast-growing market. They have great sports teams. They have infrastructure there. Hopefully, those talks can get revived and Tampa can go, because it makes no sense not to deploy robotaxis in Tampa and then also deploy them in St. Pete. Go over the causeway. You got two markets right there that is a fast-growing market.
Yeah, I agree with that. So then Chicago, I would guess, it's the third largest city, I guess, in how we look at cities. It's just going to have to be, I think, if they end up getting traction in these other cities, they'll put pressure on them. Obviously, if they can succeed in Boston and New York, Chicago won't fall far behind. So if we go past these top 20 markets, just for our listeners' intrigue, the next 3 markets where Waymo has not yet announced, it doesn't seem like there should be major political issues there, but maybe to keep your eye on. In the 21 spot, you have Charlotte. In the 22 spot, you have Baltimore. And in the 23 spot, you have St. Louis. So those are maybe 3 markets to keep your eye on. That should be a target of Waymo for, whenever they can get the volume to support that.
Look, the question is, when are they going to get the volume? That's something that you and I have been watching that we don't know. We're going to have to continue to watch, and you have to always look at the markets. Staying on the theme of markets, you were in New York. You put a photo on X. See, even when I'm building something or I'm traveling, I keep an eye on you, Walt. Don't you worry. East 12th Street, you saw a Waymo. So did you put on your hat and go chase it and say, I got to go do field work? And did you try and stop it? What did you do?
Well, for full disclosure, that was sent to me by a friend. That was not my picture, not seeing it, but this person was well-versed in what to look for. Did see a driver behind the driver wheel. This was downtown in Greenwich Village in New York City. This is part of, I guess, their road trip for New York. We have an election coming up. We'll see how that goes and see how Waymo's progresses there. But hopefully, people get excited when they see some of these robots driving around town.
Depending on the outcome of that election, Miami's economy could potentially be very happy with all the individuals migrating down there. And this week, there's photos surfacing on X. The Waymo vehicles are testing at the Miami airport. I was just there. I can't wait to have them there. What do you think? Is this a sign that when Waymo launches a new market, airports are going to come online potentially on day one?
Yeah, airports are inevitable, and maybe Miami is going to be more welcoming to it as San Francisco. I think San Jose airport obviously is going to be even more welcoming than San Francisco. So, I think you'll see kind of these domino effects in 26 and 27.
Yeah, and before we go on to a new topic that we're going to cover here, sidewalk bots, I want to offer a correction from last week. As I document, I was in the Wayve vehicle last week. I said here publicly on the podcast that vehicle had 12 cameras. The correction is it had 6 cameras, which is even more impressive. And I want to clarify the chip. It was running the NVIDIA Orin chip, and their next Gen 3 vehicle will be running the Thor. So I want to give a correction there to our audience. Now, on to sidewalk bots. The market's exploding with sidewalk bots. This week, Serve announced a partnership with DoorDash where they're going to start taking DoorDash orders starting in the LA market. And that comes on the heels of the week before when I was in London. DoorDash rolls out Dot. I much rather been checking out the Dot in San Francisco than hanging out in London. But hey, you got to do what you got to do. It seems this market's starting to get some really big momentum here.
Yeah, that was quite a change. One week you've got the Dot, which is their own robot. The next week you have them doing deals with Serve. But at the moment it looks like you've got a couple of opportunities, Serve, Coco, among others, that can address this market. There'll be kind of a race to, I think, who can develop share in there. Whether they all survive or not, we'll see. And like we see in autonomy, you have OEMs. I think the comparable here is like I'm an OEM like Toyota or whatever, and I'm developing, or Lucid, I'm developing my own internal version of autonomy, and then at the same time doing partnerships with other external autonomy companies. So if you're DoorDash, it obviously makes sense to have some internal development as well as partnering with companies like Serve, who've been successful at raising capital and starting to launching in the markets. And Serve is at this kind of inflection point to try and really get production volumes of the robots. And that ends up, there was a lot of words for me to build up to a key word that we're focused on here: production, right? Production is the key to Waymo. It's obviously going to be the key to any of these companies to get enough cars on the road fast enough to serve the demand that we think exists, whether that's taking people or, in this case with DoorDash, taking your food or whatever other small items, physical items to your customers.
The big underlining thing here that has not been highlighted enough, in my opinion, is DoorDash clearly has big autonomy ambition. So now we have Dot. They're doing stuff in drones. Perhaps they're going to do middle mile delivery, but it's clear that they have big autonomous ambitions. And Dot is not a sidewalk bot. Let's clarify that. It can go 20 miles an hour. It can go on bike lanes at 20 miles an hour. That's pretty impressive. And they're operating in Mesa and Tempe, Arizona. So I got to ask, Walt, do we have to go take a field trip to go see Dot in person?
I think that's a great idea. If they'll have us to take a look at it, 20 miles an hour, that's kind of fast. I don't think you want that necessarily on the sidewalk, but depends, I guess, what type of sidewalk that it is. And I don't know, maybe putting them in the bike lanes will slow down some of the cyclists so they don't kill the pedestrians in the first place. So maybe, stashing them in the bike lanes will be a good thing to normalize some of that traffic.
I'd like to see him in New York. And when we always do this now, and I'm loving this thing where we have to break down the hardware. So I want to break down the hardware for you that's running on Dot. It has 8 external cameras, 1 interior camera, 4 radar, 3 LiDAR sensors. The key with the LiDAR, soon to be replaced with automotive grade in an effort to save costs. DoorDash seems very focused on costs.
For this product in general, that's got to be an advantage to drive down the cost of the unit, given the margin of the goods that you're transporting. Obviously, you're going to have lower insurance costs. You're not transporting humans, but certainly driving down cost is going to be critical to make these business models successful. As we've talked about before, there's also an advertising model on the revenue side that will help to defer whatever incremental cost that you have. And maybe that justifies putting more dollars in for speakers that talk to the people that are around them, or even screens that provide live advertising and live interactivity with the community that's around this robot as it's operating. So these are, puts and takes, but generally speaking, you always want to get that cost of equipment down as low as possible, especially when you're in a scenario where these are small things and probably subject to some level of vandalization, but we'll see.
Staying on the topic of scaling, Lyft is clearly scaling their robotaxi ambitions. This week, they announced a deal with Tensor Auto to make the Tensor Auto vehicles, which are made by VinFast in Vietnam, Lyft ready off the factory line. Is this a sign of things to come for Lyft?
I think Lyft and Uber are trying to make as many relationships as possible. Lyft is insistent of how great this is because it's a Lyft-ready car. I kind of wonder why Tensor is tying themselves to Lyft this way. I mean, if Uber is kind of the larger player globally, obviously Lyft has got some Europe ambitions that they can execute on. But to be Lyft ready, you're kind of if you're Tensor, you're kind of locking yourself in. From their standpoint, they may not care, right? Because the Tensor business model is selling it to an end user. But you would say okay, if you're going to make it more attractive to the end user, say, hey, I'm going to buy this car, but at the same time, put it onto a network while I go about my day. Wouldn't you rather be partnered with Uber there than Lyft? So whatever, big win for Lyft as a result. Tensor has to obviously execute. They've kind of, to a certain extent, come from nowhere. I know you were familiar with Professor X before it kind of converted into what it is today, Tensor. But from my standpoint, they're kind of new on the map, and they've got a lot of press releases that are hitting, and Lyft seems pretty bold up for them. So I think congrats to both companies, and hopefully they succeed in pushing this forward.
Before we get into this and analyze this, do we have any clarity or insight on what a Lyft-ready car is and what it means from an engineering perspective?
I mean, we don't exactly, right? Because we're not coders. But what I've been told is it's a quote unquote deep tech integration that allows the car to be deployed on the platform right out of the parking lot. So in the case of autonomous vehicles, there's engineering software integration that needs to happen before it can get integrated on a platform. It's not like, hey, you're buying a Toyota, right? And rather than using your phone for Lyft, it's on the screen. You have to obviously integrate with how the car operates. Think about communicating positions, status of the vehicle's battery level, mapping, routing, locking, unlocking the doors, safety features. So Lyft Ready is, it's a process that's going to, quicken the time to get it on that network. So, I think that is probably more advanced than nothing.
What I'd like to know is who's footing the bill for this integration. We have the SEC filing that Uber is paying to retool the Lucid factory for that. So who's paying for the integration? That's something would offer a lot of insight to us in the market if we could understand that.
I think initially, obviously Lyft is going to put some capital to this, but ultimately this business model is end users owning these cars and be willing to spend for those cars. And the interesting thing about this is like Lyft and Tensor are executing on the model that Elon first talked about, right? This is exactly the Tesla model that you're going to buy a Tesla, you're going to have this huge residual values, you're going to turn it on and plug it into the network and off you go. And like, here we are, Lyft and Tensor with specific timelines to execute on that.
We're going to be watching it and also be watching it for the market. I'll make a prediction here. I believe the first market will not be a U.S. market. Most likely it'll be Dubai or somewhere in the Emirates. What do you think from a market perspective?
Yeah, sure. I mean, wherever, it doesn't even matter, frankly. Just get it out there working. Like I expressed some frustration a couple of podcasts ago, and I'm still, kind of in that camp. Like, just get the tech work, get the safety drivers out, get these safety attendants out, show the market that this technology works, like Waymo has been showing in several markets, and all that stuff will figure itself out. I think the markets are less important than making sure the tech works. And certainly, I don't want someone to go to a market because the regulator makes it easier for them to do it. I just want it where, some proof positive that these things are going to work and save people's lives, which will drive adoption and then change our economy.
Yeah, it'll totally change the economy. It'll eventually lead to the autonomy economy. Staying on the theme of tech that works, Aurora has proven successfully that their autonomous driving technology works. They had big news this week, wasn't widely reported, is that they got their warning trial exemption. They can use blinkers now. Big deal. It's a big step. Outside of the pack car issue, they're cleared for takeoff.
When I saw this news hit, I had the biggest smile on my face because I just remember in some of our earliest versions of Autonomy Markets where, as I was learning more about regulation in my earlier days, and it was just crazy to me that they were going to hold up this great company in Aurora based on these stupid safety triangles. And I was like joking that Chris Urmson was going to be following the cars with safety triangles in his trunk, in case they had to pull over to put the triangles there, to get this thing off the road. And then I also noted, which I continue to see, and even to this day, every time I see it, I go crazy. There's trucks parked on the side of the road on 95 right outside of New York. There's no safety triangles. Those guys are asleep. It's side of the road. It's not a park area. And there are no safety triangles. So they were holding them to a higher level. So thankfully, and congrats to Aurora, who, from the beginning said, look, we've got a plan to address this. Ironically, they don't even need it now because PACCAR is continuing to force them to have a person sitting in the driver's seat. But it brought a smile to my face because it was a kind of a closing point on an earlier topic from Autonomy Markets.
And I'm going to put the icing on the cake for you. That exemption, if you want to use a technical term, the waiver, any autonomous trucking company can apply for that, and several have. And soon we'll get FMCSA data where you and I can analyze for every single person applied for it. It is a huge positive movement and moment for the autonomous trucking industry. Not widely covered, which it should be, but there's a reason why.
Why is that, Grayson?
Fear of retribution.
Well, I have no fear of retribution. That's for sure. And that's probably got me in trouble in the past. But look, the issue when you talk about waivers, I was just at something, you're going to laugh, but there was a wireless of Hall of Fame dinner. I might have referred to this in the last podcast where, a CTO at T-Mobile was honored, whatever. But there were lawyers there because, a lot of stuff, getting stuff done for companies involves hiring lawyers to get through regulations. And this industry is no different. And the one lawyer was like honoring this woman who was considered the GOAT. He's like, she understood that there was exceptions, and then there's exceptions to the exceptions and exceptions to the exceptions of the exceptions that you need to understand with the FCC, and in this case, maybe whatever the regulatory FMCSA or whoever it is, in getting through to make this stuff work. And there's a lot of people, I focus on the tech, you focus on the regulation, but there are a lot of people at an organization that it takes to get these companies to be successful. And I think that's sometimes, not remembered, that there's, a lot of important people at these companies that it requires to get through the various regulatory hoops, technical hoops, sales hoops, whatever it is, to generate the revenue and the profit that they need to succeed.
Yep, and that's why I wrote a blog post years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and I got more nasty grams, if you want to call it that, when I said the policy team are the new rock stars, and all my engineering friends flipped out. But you know this, you can build the world's greatest product, but if the policy won't enable it to scale, you don't have a product.
Grayson, you need a wide receiver that can run a route. You need a offensive lineman that can block. You need a quarterback that can deliver the ball to the receiver that's in the end zone. And you need a coach that actually can call the right plays. And you need the GM to get the right player. So all of these things, and companies are the same thing. Like every role is important. Some may be more important than others. Like some are table stakes. You need to get the technology to work, but let's not forget the importance of our friends in the regulatory world at making sure that this is all possible.
They make sure it's all possible. And what we need to succeed, Walt, here in Autonomy Markets is news. What do we need to look for in the Autonomy Markets next week?
Can we take a week off? I mean, it's been pretty busy over the past year and a half. I have earnings that are going to start to kick in. I will have more in-depth feedback on my FSD 14. I'm sure I'll be putting on probably another 30 or 40 trips between now and our next podcast. So, we'll see what next week brings us. Who knows? Maybe Waymo announces a road trip in Charlotte. Is that next week's news?
If it is, perhaps Waymo listen to Autonomy Markets. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is great teams. Walt, until next week.